Welcome. My name is Nigel Bance, and I'm the author of The Liquidation of Raoul Wallenberg, which contains the definitive truth behind Raoul Wallenberg's execution by the Russian intelligence services in 1947. I hope you've viewed my first video, which explained how I had unearthed the smoking gun, a document I obtained in Moscow in the never-before-seen archive of Colonel General Ivan Serov, the chairman of the KGB and later the director of the GRU, the Russian Military Counterintelligence Service. In an apartment opposite the Kremlin, over several days in summer 2002, I'd been invited by members of Ivan Serov's immediate family to delve into Serov's archive, which was held in 3 large upright holdalls. A 14-page account written by Serov was part of that archive, and it revealed details of an extraordinary top-secret investigation into both the disappearance and execution of Raoul Wallenberg, an investigation ordered by Nikita Khrushchev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, in December 1953. That investigation, conducted by Serov, again in utter secrecy with a few trusted intelligence fellow officers, had concluded in March 1954. Serov, in this 14-page account, detailed why Wallenberg had been arrested in Budapest. He detailed the Soviet accusations against him of spying for the United States, as well as accusations of collaboration with Nazi intelligence, namely the Abwehr and the SD, the counterintelligence arm of the SS. So, why was Raoul Wallenberg executed by the Soviets in 1947? Whilst incarcerated in a Moscow prison cell, Wallenberg had been a political pawn. He's described in that manner by Serov. As a political pawn, he'd been used by Stalin and Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, in establishing the Soviet red lines before the Nuremberg trial of top Nazis began in November 1945. The horse trading on these red lines between the Allies that together had fought the war against Hitler and his Axis partners was bitter. Moscow had demanded that certain issues could not be raised at Nuremberg, especially on the secret protocols that Russia and Germany, allies until the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, had signed to carve up Central and Eastern Europe. There were also wartime atrocities committed by the NKVD, such as the massacre of 15,000 Polish prisoners of war that Moscow wanted to see concealed forever. The Americans and the British also had entrenched, well-entrenched red lines. Their own secrets that must be concealed from the glare of global interest and fascination in the forthcoming Nuremberg trial. US industry and America's Wall Street banks had collaborated with the Third Reich institutions. And if the depth of this collaboration ever became public, that American public would have howled with rage and demanded answers. There was another red line that most definitely the Americans and the Swedish government demanded concealment, never to be revealed. Had Sweden actually been neutral during World War II? There's plenty of evidence that Stockholm was more of a friend to Berlin than to London and to Washington. Given its neutrality, Sweden thought it could step aside from the war that has seen the occupation of two of its Nordic neighbours, namely Denmark and Norway. Sweden had openly allowed the German Wehrmacht to transit across its territory to Norway, where a military garrison of 300,000 needed to be maintained. Such neutrality appeared a myth to the US and Britain. All Allied pressure on Sweden to ban this transit traffic for the Wehrmacht was met with intransigence and contempt from several Swedish politicians. Sweden had a wartime dark side, which I extensively explore in my book. But above all, the role of the Wallenberg family itself in wartime had to be concealed at Nuremberg. And this was very key in the bartering over the red lines. Ivan Serov's account explains that position, and I would like to quote him. Quote, "The Americans had met our request not to raise the issue of the secret Ribbentrop-Molotov protocols. In exchange, we could not raise the issue of the financial ties that existed between the United States and Hitler's industrialists, arranged with the help of the Wallenberg family, and the secret contacts that had taken place on negotiating a separate peace treaty with the Germans." Note what I've just said, with the help of the Wallenberg family. That comes right out of Serov's account. These are damning words from Serov. The Wallenberg family had indeed enjoyed a profitable war, its factories churning out goods for Germany and the Allies alike. Outwardly, the British government respected Sweden's neutrality, but inwardly it seethed as Swedish industry propped up Hitler's war machine, even accepting German payments plundered from the central banks of occupied Europe. How Stalin and Molotov actually used Raoul Wallenberg as a political pawn in the drawing up of these red lines at Nuremberg is unclear. But Serov's own words in his investigation describe the situation. From the reports, said Serov, it became clear that Stalin and Molotov had planned to use evidence extracted from the interrogation of Wallenberg for secret negotiations with the Americans on issues not to be raised at Nuremberg. Note that Serov mentions interrogation. What had Wallenberg disclosed? When the Nuremberg trial of these top Nazis concluded in October 1946, Wallenberg would have only a few months to live. Yet astonishingly, according to Serov, he could have been returned safely to Sweden. Again, I quote Serov from his extraordinary archive. At the ending of the Nuremberg trials, wrote Serov, Raoul Wallenberg had lost his validity and his usefulness to us. On the orders of Molotov and Abakumov, the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs hinted to the Swedes that Wallenberg could be exchanged for the return of Soviet traitors who had escaped, defected to Sweden. These proposals yielded no results, concluded Serov. Abakumov was the notorious Soviet security and intelligence chief, and during the war he had headed Smersh, the organization that had arrested Wallenberg in Budapest. So, according to Ivan Serov, from the archive that I saw, there had been one last chance for Sweden to get back its man. But the Swedes had refused to trade. Had the Wallenberg family been privy to those freedom overtures to Stockholm made by Moscow? One must assume that the family had been in the decision loop. In his prison cell in Moscow, Wallenberg had been abandoned by his government, maybe even by his family, whose reputation had been left intact by the Nuremberg bartering over the red lines. With the onset of the Truman Doctrine, Truman being the US president, and the US approval in March 1947 to grant $400 million in military aid to Greece and Turkey to combat communist-led insurgencies, the Cold War suddenly grew much colder. Again, I quote Ivan Serov. Molotov, he said, then raised the issue of liquidating Wallenberg, as well as American, German, Japanese and other foreign citizens detained by us after the war. Stalin endorsed Molotov's proposal, believing that there was no reason now to return Wallenberg to Sweden. These are all the words of Serov taken out of his archive. Wallenberg's fate, therefore, was sealed. He was a walking dead man. As to how Wallenberg was executed and the names of his executioners, you will have to read my book. Serov also revealed that Vilmos Langfelder, his Budapest driver, also languishing in a Moscow jail, with two of Langfelder's prison cellmates, were executed by association. To the Russian intelligence services, these were loose ends that needed tidying up. I have been the only writer and researcher given access to the Serov archive by his immediate family. And my book has become the definitive account behind Wallenberg's disappearance and his subsequent execution. It is The Smoking Gun, and confirmed that Wallenberg did die in 1947. I thank you for watching my two videos. My book, The Liquidation of Raoul Wallenberg, can be ordered from any bookshop or ordered online, including Amazon and Waterstones. Within hours of Wallenberg's execution, his body was driven to the Donskoye, and the detail that had accompanied his body had carefully observed and recorded the cremation of this special prisoner. His ashes were then unceremoniously dumped into the open pit. I viewed these pits in the Donskoye. There are now headstones around these pits. No one knows whose ashes lie below. There is one pit, and it now has a stone above it. I saw this in winter time, and I pushed back the snow, and engraved on this mound in the Donskoye it says, "Common grave, number 3, victims not identified, no inquiries 1945 to 1989. The Wallenberg's ashes lay under this stone.